We hear about inclusive education all the time, right? It's become a global standard, this big promise of social justice written into laws pretty much everywhere. But beyond the principles and the policies, does it actually work for the students? Well, today, we're going to follow the evidence to find out.
Our whole approach to this has changed so dramatically over the years. You can actually see this shift just in the words we use. We've gone from a model of segregation, using terms like handicap, to integration, and the idea of special needs, and now to inclusion, where the focus is on learning difficulties. And this isn't just about swapping out words, it's a huge shift in thinking, from separating students to believing that including them is a basic human right.
And look, the moral arguments for inclusion, they are really powerful. They're written into huge international agreements like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The core idea is that every single kid has a right to a quality education right there in their own community. But, as this quote points out, principles are one thing. We also have to ask, are the outcomes actually beneficial for the child?
And that really brings us to the central question, doesn't it? The world has pretty much agreed on the why of inclusion. So now we really need to dig into the evidence and ask, how effective is it, really? Is this policy just a moral victory, or is it an educational one, too? All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll touch on the principle of inclusion. Then we'll put on our investigator hats and see why this is so tricky to research. After that, we dive into the core evidence, the outcomes for students with special educational needs, or SEN, and, just as important, the impact on their classmates. And finally, we'll deliver an evidence-based verdict.
Okay, so first up, the principle of inclusion. Let's be clear, this isn't just some passing trend. It's the default approach for modern education, laid out in major international agreements like UNESCO's Salamanca Statement and backed up by national laws. The starting point is that all children belong in the mainstream classroom.
Next up, our investigator's guide. Before we can even start to look at the results, we have to understand why it's so incredibly difficult to study this stuff. These research challenges are exactly why you can't just Google this and get a simple yes or no answer. It's complicated.
So, problem number one is just defining what inclusion even means. Seriously, what one country, or even one study from, say, 1985 calls an integrated classroom, maybe a special unit inside a mainstream school, we might look at today and call segregated. This makes comparing studies across different times and places a real apples and oranges situation. The goalposts are always moving.
And the second major issue is this giant umbrella term, SEN, or Special Educational Needs. This is not one single group of students, not even close. It covers a massive range of needs, from intellectual disabilities to behavioral disorders and way more. So a finding that's true for one of these groups just can't be applied to all the others. And that's an absolutely crucial point to remember.
Okay, now for the main event. What are the actual outcomes for students with special needs? Let's break down what the research tells us about how these students really do in inclusive classrooms.
We really need to look at this from two angles. On one side, you've got academic outcomes, progress in subjects like reading, writing, and math. But on the other side, you have psychosocial outcomes, things like self-image, making friends, social skills, and just general well-being. For a policy to be truly effective, it's got to deliver on both.
Now, check this out. This slide perfectly illustrates that SEN umbrella problem we were just talking about. This is from an early but really important meta-analysis, and what it found is fascinating. For students with cognitive impairments, being in a mainstream classroom led to better outcomes. But for students with behavioral or emotional disorders or specific learning disabilities, specialized education was actually more effective. This tells us that the best setting really depends on the student's specific needs.
But, as research methods have gotten better, the findings have become even more nuanced. For instance, a big Dutch study that followed students for 4 years found that those with mild difficulties made way more academic progress in a mainstream setting. But then you've got another study that found that even kids with severe disabilities had better outcomes in inclusive settings. So the picture's complex, but the evidence often seems to be tilting in favor of inclusion.
Okay, but what about those psychosocial factors? The social and emotional side of things? Well, here the evidence gets a lot murkier. Studies looking at things like self-image, friendships, and social skills, they're all over the place. The results are mixed, and sometimes they even contradict each other. It's just so much harder to measure, and the social dynamics of a classroom are incredibly complex. It's tough to draw a firm conclusion here.
All right, so what about the other kids in the class? This brings us to one of the biggest, most common concerns you hear from both parents and teachers.
What is the impact of all this on typically developing students?
Well, a major systematic review went out and looked at 26 different studies to answer that exact question, and their finding is pretty powerful. As you can see on this chart, in 95% of cases, the effect on typically developing peers was either positive or just neutral, no effect at all. Only a tiny fraction of studies, just 5%, found any kind of negative impact. This piece of evidence directly tackles one of the biggest anxieties people have about inclusion.
Okay, it's time for our evidence-based verdict. We've looked at the principles, the headaches of doing the research, and the outcomes for everyone in the classroom. So let's pull it all together.
As we synthesize all this, I think it's important to just take a second and remember the ultimate goal. This whole debate, all this research, it's all about trying to build an education system where every single child gets the chance to thrive, both academically and as a person.
So what's the final verdict from the research? Well, first, the evidence we have today largely supports the policy of inclusion. Second, for learners with special educational needs, an inclusive classroom is at least as effective and in many cases more effective than a segregated one. And third, their classmates are not held back by this policy.
And that leaves us with a really important forward-looking question. If the evidence is pretty much in, then maybe the whole debate needs to shift. Maybe the question is no longer if we should practice inclusion, but how. How do we make sure every teacher has the training, the resources, and the support they need to make every inclusive classroom a success for every single student in it?
And of course, if you want to dive deeper into any of the studies we talked about today, here are the primary sources we used. Thanks so much for watching.